Hello, all of my beautiful Cinnabar moths, or any kind of moth you'd like to be. Welcome to the Writer's Triangle, a podcast about publishing and all things books. And today I'm going to be talking about writing violence and trauma well. And I think a great place to start is by defining violence and defining trauma. So I'm going to start with violence, and violence can be physical or emotional. And physical violence is any physical action done with the intent to harm. And mental and emotional violence is any action done with the intent to harm, anything said or anything that the characters may experience in your writing that the setting or what have you was designed for causing harm. That's violence. And trauma, interestingly enough, is kind of a little twisted in that trauma isn't always traumatic to the character, but sometimes things that don't traumatize characters can traumatize readers, and that's how I characterize trauma. Anything that has ever hurt anybody in the whole world is traumatic. And with those two definitions, it's like Jeepers Creepers. Every story has violence and trauma in it. And technically speaking, it does. But I want to shrink down those definitions a little bit to make them more manageable. And I feel like you don't have to write every story super carefully with content notes and trigger warnings and all of that. So for me, violence are physical actions that are taken in an aggressive state. If a character is doing something physically aggressive to another character, then that is technically violence. For me, it's if it causes injury or death, that's sort of the violence that we're talking about, unless we're talking about age group. Age group makes it a little bit different. And so I think going into age group helps us frame what trauma and violence is and how to write them carefully. I really like that there has been this sort of revolution going on in picture books now where they are tackling more difficult topics and they are treating children like they're people and thinking and understanding that everything our children come in contact with, that they're being imprinted. And for me, with picture books, I have a general rule that it shouldn't be graphic. I don't, because it's there in picture form, I don't think the text should be graphic when it comes to violence and trauma. And that's where we have to use the broad umbrella when we're defining violence and trauma. And that violence is any physical act done with the intention to harm. And trauma is any action that could harm a reader. And we do need to be that strict because we are talking about little people, right? We're talking about children that are being read to as early as infancy, and these books are imprinting on them. So we need to be really careful and respectful of who our target audience is, and are we serving that audience well? Are we being good keepers of that audience? And are we being responsible and caring? And does the violence and trauma in a picture book have a purpose? Is it teaching a lesson? And I do believe at that age there has to be a lesson to come out of it, whether it's anger management or handling bullies or dealing with family trauma or any kind of trauma that a little person may experience of loss or hurt. And there has to be hope in the telling of it, because I think we need to be really careful that we are building hope and positivity in children. And the same goes for when you're looking at middle grade with violence and trauma. I don't like graphic depictions of violence and graphic depictions of trauma in middle grade books. I find them to be very inappropriate because you have to look at what can, and I'm a trauma survivor, just as an FYI, and I was traumatized from a very early age. I entered the foster care system before I was a year old. So for me, I speak from my own place of being, even if you are a trauma survivor, I just feel like graphic books wouldn't have been appropriate for me or for any child. And that's my bias. There may be people out there that have something different. We're just one press and I'm just one opinion. But I really do think that when you're writing for middle grade and especially in picture books, that there has to be hope hard baked in there, because I look back at what would I have needed at that age when if I were reading about some of the trauma that I experienced. And I think even having experienced some of that trauma, it would have been incredibly inappropriate for me to be reading about that type of trauma without a survivor story in it and without it being really watered down. Because when you're that age and you're experiencing trauma, you don't actually understand the depth and gravity of it until you're older. And you don't understand the depth and gravity of how it will impact you for the rest of your life until you've lived some life. So I don't think that saying, hey, they need to hear their story told is good reasoning for that at all. And if you're writing for middle grade children, you should never ever be writing from the perspective of the perpetrator, ever, as a rule, because that anyone who's harming children, you're garbage. I'm sorry. I'm not going to be tactful about that or politically correct. And I just don't think those garbage perspectives belong in the middle grade space. I think the middle grade space and the picture book space needs to be really protective, because we need to be protective of our children. And I feel like, fight me if you don't agree with me on this. And I'm I'm not, changing my position ever. And other people may think otherwise. The reason I have this is because children are reading books that adults don't know they're reading. When children go into school or out of the home, wherever it is they go, very rarely are children just alone. I'm at home rather and supervised. They spend a lot of time alone, rather, is what I was trying to say. And in that alone space, you have to ask yourself, will you feel okay with a child of whatever age you're writing for reading this book and forming their own thoughts about it without ever speaking to anyone about it, and just having their own internal life and internal mind space occupied by what you're writing? And that's why I think when we're writing middle grade, the vantage point of the perpetrator is not necessary. And so even if you look at some of the lighter trauma, like a series of unfortunate events, doesn't really write from the perspective of the perpetrator. It has like little sneaks and peeks into their motivation, but doesn't go deeply into what they're experiencing when they're doing violence or trauma. And I think that that's a really important thing to maintain when writing for middle grade. And I'm very strict about it. And we do have our middle grade books don't have any hardcore trauma in them. They do have some implied violence, and there is some horror and some negative things that go on, but there isn't deep down psychological and emotional trauma, because I find that writing that for middle grade is harder than most people can manage for my standards. And from my perspective, would we welcome those kinds of books? Absolutely. I would give them a read and consider them. But if it's not done well, and if the message isn't one of hope that gives hope, then for me, it would be a pass. And to give an idea, of my level of sensitivity, it would be really, really hard. It would have to be done so well and so tastefully. And the taste level comes in with the descriptions and how graphic are the descriptions. And so much can be implied to where you can take them just up to the edge of danger without going in and describing any of the trauma. And the children who have survived it, the approach is enough. They know what the outcome of that approach is. And children that haven't been exposed to that aren't in jeopardy of being traumatized by something they read. And that is down to graphicness and perspective. I think that's also true for young adults. I think for young adults, it can be broadened a bit and a little bit more detail can be brought in, but I don't think that the detail should be graphic in nature. Any descriptions of violence or any depictions of trauma, I don't think that they should be spelled out. And I use one of the most traumatic books I remember reading as a middle grader going into YA, and that was The Diary of Anne Frank, where so much was implied in reading the diary, but it was written from a young mind, that when you get older, you realize the totality and completeness of how traumatic that event was, but you don't have it in the middle grade mindset and space or the YA mindset and space until you learn about World War II in history. And I think that happens in high school. And I want to say, I think Anne Frank is kind of in that interesting space, and that some people are reading it at the middle grade level and some people are reading it at the YA level, depending on what your school curriculum is for, elementary school, junior high, and high school. So using that as sort of a guideline, I think really is helpful to me in terms of understanding what my own boundaries are. There is a lot of trauma inherent in that, but as an adult, we get the full context of it, and it becomes all that much more horrific and traumatic. And I think that's what good YA and middle grade trauma and violence does, is that when we look back, we're like, wow, I see all of these levels, and it's much deeper and way more intricate than I understood it at 8 years old or 12 years old or 13. And I have a deeper appreciation for the book. And when you're writing it, I think you do need to have that implied and inferred a great deal in middle grade. And I think when you get to YA, depending on which section of YA you're at, if you're in that YA new adult cusp, I think you can write it almost to the level of adult. If you're on the younger side of YA, I do think it has to be closer to what you're doing in the middle grade space. That's what makes YA really interesting to me, is because I do believe we need to make new adult happen. I think it should be a category. Because I think some books are just too mature really for that 13, 14-year-old. And looking at how we dice up the ages, YA isn't fully 16 to 22. And I feel like new adult would be like 17 to 23 or 17. Yeah, I want to stick with 23. I know new 23 may not feel like new adult, but there are some people on the younger side of 23, and I think they fit firmly in new adult because you're still having those college experiences and such. And I think post the college years, I feel around 25 with brain maturation and the way the brain forms. Our brain is fully formed around age 24. So I'm basing it on that. Sorry, I'm basing it on that, and I think that age range for me, I really wish there was that new adult category for that. Because I feel like with YA, if you look at YA, if you're under 16 in YA, then you do need to still be doing some implied, some inferred, where you're going up to the approach and you're sort of having like superhero level violence, where it is extremely violent, but there's no gore. And violence without gore, I think that any superhero movie kind of captures that. Like, you shoot people, but there may be a couple of drops of blood. There's not big pools of blood everywhere. And that is kind of how I think of writing for YA and middle grade. For new adult, I think there can be more graphic descriptions of it, and you can start getting into some of the more traumatic things that people experience in life. And you can get into a little bit more, you can get the approach and the aftermath, but I don't think that the episode should be written. So if there's like a violent shooting, there's no slow motion description of the bullet going in and what it feels like and all of that. And if there's other sorts of trauma like fighting, there's not like the knocking out of teeth and broken noses and the crunching of bones and all of that. And if you're dealing with intimate partner violence or gender violence or bullying in school, sorry, the more I talk, the thicker my throat feels. Sorry about that. Um, and so for me, we have some very graphic, mature YAs that I think do a really great job of explaining and detailing trauma without brutal graphic descriptions. And you don't have to be brutal and graphic to get the point across and capture all of the trauma. And by brutal and graphic, I mean stroke for stroke with the violence, stroke for stroke with the trauma. Is it necessary? You can say this thing happened and have it be enough and have it be understood, if that makes sense. So that's my rule for violence and trauma at the picture book, middle grade, and YA and new adult. When it comes to writing graphic trauma, and we do have books that have graphic trauma that are in the adult space, squarely in the adult space. For me, the importance of that is if you are going to write from the perpetrator's perspective, understanding why. Why am I choosing to go into the space of perpetrator? And if it's for the glorification of the perpetrator, it's going to be a hard pass for us as a press and hard pass for me as a reader. There are books out there that do it well. They're just not my cup of tea. And I'm one person's perspective. And there are, exceptions to every rule because I'm a huge fan of some serial killer personas and some books written from a serial killer's perspective. And for me, that's sort of what falls outside of the rules if they're a serial killer. Getting into the mind of a serial killer can be a very interesting read if that space is complex. If all they are is just violence and no reason, no rhyme, just full on horror show all of the time, I don't find that to be an interesting read, and I find that to be a one dimensional character. And if that character is one dimensional, why am I reading this? I'm going to be bored. And it's what they do is not going to be traumatizing, and it's going to be gratuitous violence. So if you're writing splatterpunk from the perspective of the perpetrator, make sure you're having that character be fully realized. Because if you think about, like, I think splatterpunk, like the Saw movies, Saw 1 was really interesting. The latest Saw movie was just gore. That's all it was. Are you writing the last Saw movie or the first Saw movie? And asking yourself, is this just supposed to be drivel? Or is it going to be engaging? And to me, violence and trauma is best written when it's engaging and not drivel. And that's down to how dimensional are your characters. It still has to have a story arc. It still has to have peaks and valleys. It has to have pacing. There has to be motivations and intentions and an understanding of where are these motivations and intentions coming from. If you're writing from a perpetrator's perspective, that's going to be so important. Make them a character. Make me at least interested. And don't try and make them revolting. Make them authentic. Make them real. If this person had a workaday life, what are they doing in the actual space that they live in or the universe that you've created? What is their truth? What are their interests? What are their hobbies? Even if you don't include them in the book, understanding who your characters are at that level, like what's their favorite color? If you're into astrology, what's their sign? All of those kinds of things having that kind of backstory knowledge of your characters will make them ring authentic. So when you're writing all of these dark and gruesome things, then you're doing it with a sort of understanding of the nuance that comes with being fully human and fully realized as a character. The same can be said for survivors. When you're writing survivors, if their entire story is the trauma they endure and nothing else, are they your main character? Because a main character has to have something other than that. They either have a life before the trauma or a life after the trauma or both. If you are one of those bold writers who's going to kill off your MC at the end of the story, by all means, please, please, please do that. But absolutely give me something to a toehold to hold on to, something for me to feel interested and engaged in at the beginning of the story, so that when I feel their loss, I am deeply hurt. I should be mourning the loss of them, and that's going to require that they be fully realized, right? And that they have a life before the trauma happens, so I can know what have they lost. If you drop me in the middle of the story and it's just trauma, then, and that's their whole story, it kind of feels like, what's the point? Like, why did you do that? That doesn't make any sense to me. And again, I'm just one person, I'm just one reader, but I really strongly feel that. Like, and there have been stories that where you start the story, it's where the trauma starts happening. You meet the main character in the trauma space, and that's completely workable. You can absolutely do that as an author. But if you're going to do that, there has to be those moments of humanity and moments of relief, moments of joy. No, the human brain cannot handle just misery. The human brain will find sparks of joy in even the most desolate. And that's why when you see people writing about people who are imprisoned and they make a friend with an insect, or you're finding people that have been kidnapped and they, become friends with the crack in the wall, or there's always something that sparks joy in the character, or something they do to maintain themselves, and something they do to have hope that this isn't going to be there forever. And there does need to be hope in the trauma. There has to be hope for the characters who are being traumatized, or hope for the perpetrator. Are they hoping that they get to keep on killing? Are they hoping that they continue to be violent? What's driving all of the characters? They have to be fully realized. So when writing trauma, I think we do have to talk about content notes. Understand what your content notes should be and your trigger warnings. If you want to do content notes or trigger warnings, we do content notes, and we don't do content notes for every book that has violence. And some people are very upset with us that we didn't do it for every bit of violence in every single book that we publish. And the reason that we didn't do it is because if it's expected within the type of story that it is, based on the back cover, we tend to not put it in unless it's really graphic. And for us, that's down to us whether or not we think it's graphic, and it is down to you as an author. I hope that whoever publishes your book, if you're a self-published author, it's going to be you. This is where beta readers come in handy, and our rule of thumb is 5 beta readers, and there are tons and tons of ways to get beta readers. You can get them either through social media, or there's like Upwork and Fiverr and a bunch of different sites like that, where you can have beta readers read it and ask them, do you think this book needs a content note or trigger warning? And you can have them read just for that. And if they're reading just for that, you don't have to take on everything that your beta readers say. We absolutely don't apply everything our beta readers tell us. But we do take them into consideration, and there have been times where we didn't follow what the beta reader advised, and we get hit by that by the reviewers. And that's one of the things I love about having beta readers is it prepares us for what reviewers are gonna say. And we have a form that we ask all of our beta readers to fill out, and I think this is a great thing to do, especially if you're writing violence and trauma, is create a beta reader questionnaire. And you can Google beta reader questionnaires. There's tons of templates on the internet for you to see to give you a guide of what you should be asking beta readers, especially if you're in the violence and trauma space as a writer. And one of the things that we have on it is we ask, does the trauma feel true to the world and context, story, and characters? And does the trauma feel gratuitous? There is a level where you're writing trauma that it feels gratuitous. And if that's your goal, if you're writing that type of book where there is gratuitous trauma, you absolutely have the right to write those kinds of books. Be aware that that's what you're writing. And that's why we ask the question, because we want to know, is this going to be viewed as gratuitous? For some books, we're like, yes, absolutely, there's gratuitous violence in this book. It's a violent book. And it is what it is, and some of it we feel is intricate to the story. We don't have gratuitous trauma, so we do gratuitous violence, but we don't want to leave um the people in the story scarred afterwards just for the purpose of leaving them scarred afterwards. We do want it to tie into the story and to make sense in the world and universe that the characters create. So that's my 50 cents on writing violence and trauma. I hope you got something out of this. And if you're listening to this wherever your podcast is carried, please go on over and visit our YouTube page and give us a like and comment and subscribe and turn on the notification bells. It really helps the channel out, and it really helps the podcast out. And be sure to leave a review wherever you're listening to this. And we completely appreciate you. Thank you so much. I want to thank all of our beautiful Cinnabar moths, or any kind of moth you'd like to be. Or you can even be a butterfly, but I'm not Mariah Carey and I'm not trying to bite her rhyme. Bye.